We're not saying no one can ever fly. We're certainly not saying no one can ever go on holiday. We're saying let's all collectively do more train travel. Let's cut back on unnecessary flights. Let's try and get the small group of people who are the ones causing this problem, the frequent flyers, the private jet users. Let's get those people to change their behaviour. Let's get this industry on a pathway that is actually more sustainable. Let's, stop believing in magical solutions, and let's do the things that actually work.
Welcome to Sustainability in the Air, the world's first podcast dedicated to sustainable aviation. I'm your host, Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simplifying. Every Thursday, I have important conversations with top aviation executives, technology entrepreneurs, and policymakers helping aviation take climate action. Conversations that help separate the signal from the noise. Whether you are a frequent flyer or an airline executive, if you care about sustainability or simply love traveling, welcome aboard. My guest today is Alethea Warrington. Ali is a senior campaigner with Possible, a climate activist group that is quite active in Europe and the UK. Ali and her team have recently put out reports which have analyzed airlines' claims around climate targets and how a lot of them were missed. They've also been advocating a frequent flyer levy. I discuss with a lot of passion all of these points and a lot more with Ali on how aviation can become sustainable. This is one of the more depressing yet curious conversations I've had of late, and this is an important perspective that needs to get out to the airline world as well. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. Ali, why are you so angry at the airline world? I heard you speak in person in London, and I could feel the anger. Why are you angry?
No, I'm angry because we are in the middle of a climate crisis. People and communities around the world are already feeling the impacts. The impacts are going to get worse over the next few decades if we don't take urgent action now. Aviation is a high carbon industry. There is no reasonable way for it to decarbonise on the timeframes that matter to the climate crisis. And instead of being honest about that and thinking about ways to minimise the harm that it causes, the aviation industry is essentially operating a greenwashing operation so that it can continue to grow in the face of the climate crisis. And yeah, that makes me angry. I think it's incredibly irresponsible behaviour.
Wow. Okay. We have a lot to unpack there, I think, over the next 1 hour, because I like to say I truly believe in the magic of flying, and I do have jet fuel in my veins. That's how much I love the airline world with passion. And I'm a product of aviation. I was born in India. I grew up in Singapore. I have lived in places from Boston to Kampala, Uganda, to multiple towns in Canada, and now in London. I would not be me if not for the magic of flying. And I would consider myself privileged, having lived in multiple places, studied and worked in multiple places as well. But then there are lots of places in the world and people in the world for whom aviation is essential, not just a privilege. Aviation connects small remote islands from Norway to the Philippines. It connects small communities in Alaska, and there's the milk run in Australia. These communities would be completely disconnected without the gift of aviation. Then what?
So there is a role for some connectivity flights. No one is saying let's close down all flights immediately. Things like humanitarian flights, medical flights, absolutely, there is a role for that. But what we are against is frequent flying for leisure travel by a very, very small group of people who are the wealthiest in society, whose, as you say, privileges are coming at the expense of all of us. They're coming at the expense of future generations. And I think as well that, you're someone who's very sort of emotionally attached to aviation. But the reality is that for a lot of people who are flying often, the small group of people who are causing the problem, they don't have that emotional attachment. And something I always find quite interesting is that a survey of frequent flyers found that half of the flights that they took, they themselves described as having no value. So this is a huge, huge chunk of emissions that we could be cutting without causing huge problems, even to the people taking those flights. And let's look at what is at stake here with the climate crisis. It's people's ability to survive. And the kind of mobility that you're talking about compared to survival is a luxury. The ability to take 5 or 6 foreign holidays a year, that is a luxury.
Wow, okay. 5 or 6 foreign holidays a year. I personally don't know too many people who do that. But I found that interesting. You said there was a survey where half of the frequent flyers said that the flights that they took half the time.
So the frequent flyers on average said that half of the flights they took weren't important.
I wonder why they took them. Not because of a cheap fare.
I mean, I think the cheap fares do have quite a lot to do with it, that people are like, oh, look, I can get this, this flight to Spain for 30 quid, I might as well. I think advertising is another aspect. The aviation industry spends a huge amount on advertising, and they do that for a reason. They do that to encourage people to take flights. And it is the case that there are some journeys which are hugely important to people. For example, being able to see families and loved ones who live in distant countries. But I think, given that we need to cut back on flights to protect the climate, the flights that need to be cut are the excessive flights, the frequent flights, the flights that aren't really fulfilling any good purpose.
Okay, so let's talk about this frequent flyers. Specifically, your organization is calling for a frequent flyer levy to manage flight demand. How would this work in practice? And do you think this will truly have an impact in reducing emissions?
Yeah, so the thing about aviation is that it is hugely unequal. So as you would expect, it is very strongly correlated with wealth. And what that means is that in every country, just a small group of people take most of the flights. So in the UK, just 15% of people take 70% of all the flights, while half the population doesn't fly at all in any given year. And so what a frequent flyer levy would do would be to target the reductions in flying that are needed at that small group of people. So the way it would work is that it would be a progressive tax that increases per flight that each person takes. So your first flight in a given time period would be untaxed, to protect access to some air travel for many people. And then there'd be a progressively higher charge levied on each subsequent flight.
I wonder what this does to demand, because let's say we walk in to an airline CEO's office and say, you know what, you got to tax your frequent flyers. In fact, your top tier platinum gold, your most profitable customers will now need to pay more. That CEO is not going to like you. Firstly, because they're the most profitable customers. The other thing is loyalty programs at airlines are some of the few pure profit centers, from selling miles to credit cards and banks to just the program in itself with all its partnerships. These are very profitable aspects of the business. Would a frequent flyer levy dampen demand? Have you done some studies on this as well?
Well, we certainly hope that a frequent flyer levy would dampen demand. Yeah, I mean, this is the whole point of it. And the reason why demand has to fall is because all the claims that the aviation industry is making about how it can decarbonise using technologies alone just don't stack up. They're extremely unrealistic. They're not based on a reasonable assessment of the resources that are available or the funding that is available for the aviation industry. And that means that, yes, we do have to cut back on demand. And yeah, I think it probably is the case that this is the most profitable passengers, the frequent flyers, the business class passengers, the first class passengers are exactly the flights that we should be looking to cut back on. And yeah, absolutely, this is going to cut into the profitability of the aviation industry. But again, we have to remember what is at stake here. It's a livable climate for all of us. And part of the problem is that the aviation industry is not being honest about the situation it's facing. It's not even looking at a kind of, static situation. It is actively looking to expand. Airlines are looking to expand the number of routes they fly. Virtually every airport in the UK is trying to expand. This is not the actions of a high carbon sector, which is taking an honest or realistic look at its impact on the climate or having a strategy to deal with it. So yeah, its profits are going to be hit. But, you could say the same thing for BP or Shell. Yeah, the profits of high carbon sectors are going to be hit because essentially we have to choose. It's their profit or it's our lives. We can't have both.
But the interesting thing is BP and Shell can and already do have renewable energy businesses, and they, I think, in the long term expect that renewable energy will bring them as much revenue and profits as others. But you can't fly an electric plane tomorrow or a hydrogen plane tomorrow. Airlines have to have a sustainable business to be environmentally sustainable as well. So if you take away the most profitable aspect of the business, the airline itself is no longer financially viable.
Yeah, I mean, sadly, I don't think it's the case that BP or Shell are transitioning to renewables. They could and should be doing that. They are refusing to do it. They're trying to push forward with new oil and gas expansion, which is incredibly dangerous. And yeah, it is the case that there just isn't a way for the aviation industry to do what the broader energy sector has done and get onto renewable energy. There's very high technological barriers to developing both hydrogen and electric aircraft. This isn't something the industry is going to be able to roll out on any meaningful scale for many decades, if ever. And yeah, this is going to impact their profitability because, how do you keep burning kerosene in a world where every other sector has to get its emissions to zero? Yeah, you can't. And if your profits depend on that, your profits are going to shrink. Yeah.
Okay. I think that will be a tough pill for the industry to swallow. But there was a point you made earlier around claims being missed. You have actually conducted research that showed that airlines have met only one of over 50 climate targets set over the past 20 years. What do you think are the main reasons for this widespread failure to meet targets?
Yeah, so the research that we conducted looked at the aviation industry's history of setting their own targets, which were mainly on improved efficiency and also the rollout of alternative aviation fuels. And as you say, we found that they missed all but one target. I think there's two reasons for this. One is that those targets are hard to reach. Airplanes are already very, very efficient. Airlines have always had an incentive to minimise their fuel use to maximise their profits. And it's also very difficult to roll out alternative fuels because the supply is very limited and they're always going to cost more than kerosene. So there's always going to be a tension between alternative fuels and profitability. But I think the broader reason that they didn't reach those targets is because those targets weren't things that they ever particularly cared about meeting or intended to meet. They were essentially a form of greenwashing, a way to say to the travelling public and to regulators that there was no need for policies to constrain demand or climate action essentially on against the aviation industry because they had a plan and everything was fine and we should continue to buy tickets because they could, techno-fix their way out of this problem while continuing to grow. That's what those targets were for, I think.
I think that's a very strong claim that airlines have intentionally misled the public that they are doing something about it and nothing is being done. Possible has, of course, filed 2 legal claims against British Airways and Virgin Atlantic on greenwashing. What do these specifically deal with?
Yeah, so we filed complaints using the OECD mechanism, which is there to protect consumers against misleading claims made by multinational corporations. And the type of claims that both these airlines were making were essentially saying that they had a plan to get their emissions on track, and also about the things that they're doing at the moment. So the effectiveness of things like starting to use alternative fuels and also using offsets. And we think that these claims just don't stack up. They're not supported by the evidence. And we're concerned that ordinary people who are making decisions based on how to travel, based on factors including the environmental impact, are just not going to have the time or resources to dig into the details of why alternative fuels don't work or why offsets don't work. And if they see, airline adverts saying things like, oh, you can address your climate impacts with us, our offsets have got this under control, the kind of claims that are all over airlines' websites, then we just think that is misleading for consumers. And there have been some very encouraging court rulings recently, the KLM case, basically saying that the claims the airline was making about the effectiveness of measures it was taking to address its climate impacts were found by the Dutch court not to stack up.
So this is interesting, and I'd love to dig in a bit further on this. For example, I do know I've had both the heads of sustainability of Virgin Atlantic and British Airways on this podcast, and I do know that British Airways is doing everything from investing in hydrogen aircraft for the future to buying SAF today and using it out of their fleet from Heathrow. Virgin Atlantic famously conducted the world's first 100% SAF commercial flight across the Atlantic not too long ago. Why are these efforts greenwashing? They are doing things.
So I think the problem is that the things that they are doing are very small scale, they're not scalable, and they also are just not doing what is claimed for them. So, to take the example of that Virgin Atlantic flight, yes, they managed to fly that plane on alternative fuels, but that doesn't mean that those fuels themselves that they used are sustainable or that those fuels are remotely scalable. I mean, let's look at what was actually in that aircraft. It was things like fuels from biomass, it was fuels from animal fat, basically, and neither of those things are sustainable or scalable. The aviation industry's demand for kerosene is so huge. If it tries to fulfill that demand using biomass, that's going to lead to deforestation, it's going to lead to food prices going up, it's going to increase hunger, it's going to increase the use of monoculture plantations, which are, of course, hugely environmentally damaging. And, animal agriculture is incredibly high carbon, incredibly environmentally destructive. And the idea that you can just, scrape something off the slaughterhouse floor, put it in a jet engine, and that is job done for the entire, the global fleet of aviation and the size of its kerosene demand. And the problem was that Virgin's flight wasn't portrayed as like, okay, we've proved that this is technically possible. They were like, okay, this is it. We've got a solution. We're going to roll this out. And they simply won't be able to do this. It's just not going to be a workable strategy. And therefore, I do think that the communications from airlines are misleading. And, I've also had conversations with, heads of sustainability at some airlines, not the two we filed complaints against who have refused to engage with us, but others. And, they're worried, they want to do what's best for the industry, but at the same time, they are fundamentally not acknowledging the basic fact that all these technologies have such big limitations.
May I beg to differ? Specifically talking about the Virgin Atlantic flight. I think it was a demand signal to the oil industry that aviation is ready for 100% SAF. It was a very strong marketing NPR push to, for the first time, SAF making news beyond aviation circles. We within the industry definitely talk about it, but I remember having a Christmas dinner conversation where two of my family members who have nothing to do with aviation quizzed me, wait, really? Did a plane fly on waste fuels? And I said, wow, how do you know about it? And I said, well, Branson was doing something about it and talking about it. He says, yes, absolutely. So the awareness is now getting further that the airline industry is ready. I don't think this flight was supposed to demonstrate scalability of the type of SAF that was used. It was a demonstration flight. It was a pilot flight. It's like saying, because SpaceX's first re-entry rocket crashed, you can never get to Mars.
But if these fuels aren't scalable, then what on earth is the point of them? And I think the scientific research on this is really clear. The report from the Royal Society found that to fulfill even just the UK's demand for alternative fuels would use up something like half the UK's agricultural land and double the UK's renewable energy supply. I mean, where are these resources going to come from? It's I think it's very, very clear that they are actually not scalable. We cannot devote the world's virtually entire supply of agricultural land and electricity supply to the aviation industry. We simply cannot do that. There's going to be increasing demands on land, including for nature restoration, reforestation. There's going to be increasing demand on electricity because we have to also decarbonise the electricity grid. We have to decarbonise heat. We have to decarbonise surface transport. All of those things means that demand for electricity is going to hugely increase. There simply is not the supply of resources that is needed for aviation demand on anything like its current scale, let alone the huge growth in passenger numbers that the industry wants to see. Within the boundaries of one planet's resources and what we can actually use, it's just not possible.
Okay, let's build on this further. I find the discussion quite intriguing. The reality is that the type of fuel that was used on the Virgin flight is the HEFA pathway, and hence the feedstock was crops and waste fuels. But that's not the pathway that's going to be existing, let's say, beyond the 2030s or 2035s in Europe especially. And there are other pathways that are coming up as well, like power to liquid. Those can be scalable with solar as a source for power, for example, or wind as a source of power.
But again, let's look at the reasonable rate of deployment of these technologies. So the power to liquid is just incredibly energy intensive. You've got the renewable electricity, and then you've got the green hydrogen, which of course also requires huge amounts of electricity, and you've got the energy that it takes to process them, and all the numbers on the size of the electricity infrastructure that would be needed for this are just absolutely gigantic. And let's remember, we're in a world where many people around the world don't have access to electricity for even their most basic needs, even to heat their homes. And until we have brought people around the world up to a basic level of access to energy, the idea that we're going to have the resources or the capacity to scale up to essentially create a whole additional electricity industry at the size of the world's current deployed renewable capacity to make these e-fuels, I just find it mind-boggling that people think that this is going to be doable. And renewables are extremely efficient, as you say, things like wind turbines, but at the same time the planet's resources are limited, land is limited, all of these things are limited, and the scale of resources that would be needed to essentially replace aviation's demand for kerosene is just gigantic. So, I'm not saying there will be no role for these technologies. I'm saying that they are going to have to go alongside quite serious demand constraint, because otherwise the amount of resources going to the aviation sector is just going to be impossible.
So I'm then guessing if there is demand for these same resources, let's say electricity, in other industries, what this is going to do is that the price of SAF made from a PTL pathway might be higher than what's predicted, and a higher price may transpire to customers, which may then dampen demand. If that's how it plays out, I'm fine with that, because then demand and supply economics takes place. Some government subsidies come in, some startup grants come in, some technology companies want to buy Scope 3 emissions and offtakes. That comes in to overall, reach an equilibrium, which may be a new equilibrium.
Yeah, I just think that's going to have a lot of consequences. So say that the price of electricity goes up because of the demand for power to liquid. That will go up across the economy. It will mean that people's energy bills go up. It will mean that people then face higher prices to heat their homes because the wealthiest few in society want to keep on flying. I don't think that's fair. I don't think that would have public support. And in terms of the price going up for aviation, this is a sector that is hugely untaxed at the moment. It doesn't pay a single penny of tax on all the fuel that it burns. So yes, the cost of flying does have to go up, but if that goes up in a kind of uniform way, then essentially what we're going to have is a situation where poorer people who already fly least often are going to be priced out of flying entirely, while wealthier people who fly most often will be able to keep on flying. Again, that's not fair. It's inequitable. I don't think that's going to be a situation that would have public support. There has to be an angle of fairness, and I think that's something that applies across action to tackle the climate crisis, it has to be done fairly and in ways that don't worsen existing social inequality.
I take that point. I take that point around social equity, and the wealthy few shouldn't be doing all the flying at the expense of the poorer few. Now, you're calling for a ban on fossil fuel powered private jets by 2030. What alternatives do you see as viable for the sector by that date? Or is the expectation that all of this traffic then just moves to commercial aviation?
Yeah, so we're actually calling for a ban on private jets flying on all liquid fuels. So that would include alternative fuels. And that's because private jets are just incredibly wasteful. They are so completely grotesque, whole grade airplane sometimes with one or two people on it for routes that are very well served by commercial aviation, often very well served by trains. It's just a complete waste of scarce resources and emissions that shouldn't be burning. And the thing with private jets is that they're often, these journeys are often quite short journeys with a small number of people. And to the extent that alternative methods of propulsion, so electric planes, might be possible to develop, they are certainly going to be best suited to this kind of short journey. And of course, it's also the case that if anybody has the resources to invest in developing an entirely new kind of aircraft, it is the extremely excessively wealthy people who are flying on private jets. So, it's not impossible that if there was a ban date put in place, the private jet industry would put a bit more energy into developing electric planes. But, if they don't, tough. There's just no room for these kind of wastes of carbon in a world facing the climate crisis. And I think this is also important because of the scale of changes that all of us are going to have to make to our lives. So people are going to have to change the way that they travel to work, the way they heat their homes, even the food that they eat to really get on top of emissions. And we can't ask people to make that scale of changes if you still have this, this grotesque carbon inequality of a tiny, tiny wealthy elite flying around in private jets, this disgusting waste of emissions that they're not even paying taxes on. It's just clearly not fair. And I think the reason why we're seeing more and more resistance to private jets is that people can see this. People are saying, well hang on, I have to pay tax on fuel that I have to buy to drive to work because there's no decent public transport. Why is this multi-millionaire flying around in their private jet and not paying a single penny of tax? Something is wrong here.
That's interesting. Do you think private aviation can then serve potentially as a petri dish for sustainable aviation, given that it's a small number of individuals, short routes? They can go ahead and buy SAF for all their flights. They can transition first to electric aviation because they can afford it.
Well, I don't think SAF is a solution, and there's going to be an absolutely tiny quantity of alternative fuels available. I don't think we should waste that on private jets. That's just, not an efficient use of resources. And we've currently seen no signs that the private jet sector is going to play a leading role in developing and deploying electric aircraft. They're obviously not going to do it without regulation. They're not going to do it without, say, a phase-out date being set. They might not even do it then, but it would be up to them. But certainly more regulation is needed. There's been a lot more talk about taxing these flights. They're just grotesquely undertaxed. Our research found that they're paying a smaller proportion of the ticket price in tax than regular customers on normal flights. Clearly, that's ridiculous.
No, the taxation bit does sound quite wrong, the way you're positioning it. Having said that, I know of private aviation companies that are doing their bit. For example, Gulfstream operated a 100% SAF flight a week before the Virgin Atlantic flight. I do know there are new startups like Beyond Aero, which are developing a hybrid hydrogen-powered flight for private aviation. And I believe that the sector is in a pole position to accelerate the advent of sustainability into aviation rather than, just be completely otherwise. The other interesting thing is you mentioned, let's move to commercial aviation. Possible advocates for reducing flights by 36% to meet the UK's climate targets. What mix of policies do you think could achieve this reduction, and how does this impact the average traveler?
Yeah, so that number is the result of a study that we published with the think tank Chatham House at the end of last year. And what the report did was it basically redid the analysis underlying the UK government's aviation policy, the Jet Zero pathway, but using more realistic input assumptions about the possible rate of technological development. And the result of that was that to have any chance of keeping aviation within the UK's emissions budget, demand for flights had to go down by at least a third by 2030 compared to 2019 levels. But actually, it would be possible to achieve this with a fairly minimal impact on most people because access to aviation is so unequal. So what we found was that in order to get that 1/3 reduction, all that would be needed was for the 23% of people who fly most often to cut back by one return flight per year, and for no one to take more than 4 return flights per year. Everyone else would be unaffected. And, don't take more than 4 return flights a year. It's such a reasonable ask. The vast majority of people, I think would be like, yes, of course, that is beyond reasonable. And in terms of the policies, obviously we want a frequent flyer levy because that's going to be essential for fairness. We also want a kerosene tax. The UK public finances are so stretched. We're struggling to afford hospitals. Children are going hungry. It's time for the aviation industry to start paying a fair share of tax. And we also need an immediate ban on airport expansions. It's clear there's just no emissions budget for the industry to expand, and we shouldn't be allowing it to lock in infrastructure that, if it's built, is likely to be used with an increase in flights.
I think 4 flights a year is something, you're right, most people would be fine with. I'll share my personal story. I first was forced, my teammate, to do my own carbon analysis on my CO2 footprint a few years ago, and I was shocked because I was driving an electric car. I was living in a country and a state with completely clean electricity. I was recently turned vegan, so I thought I was doing pretty good, but then I was flying a lot.
Yeah.
And I decided to be conscious about my flying since then, and a few years ago, I did fly 75 flights because I work in aviation, and it's not the most I've heard. I then reduced that to 45 flights in 2019, so the year before COVID. And of course, COVID, everything stopped. And since then, in 2022, I cut that down to 15 flights. And that was work and pleasure and not round trips. So this is about 7.5 round trips, if you think about it, or a bit. And it's not that my business shrunk by 5x from 75 flights to 15 flights. In fact, the year I took 15 flights was our best year revenue-wise in 16 years of existence. So yes, I think it can be done. And I strongly advocate that people are conscious about their flying and don't just jump on a flight just because there's a cheap fare or a beautiful picture of a beach, or just because someone else is asking you to fly or paying for you to fly, often in business. For example, I know frequent flyers, for example, who will take an extra segment on a flight because they can earn more miles or earn a status, and I do think that's wasteful. One of the realities, though, is I was recently listening to the Air France-KLM CEO, Ben Smith, and he talked about how they are renewing their fleet. And they're doing a pretty good job of getting the new A350s. Very efficient aircraft, can fly long haul, save a lot of fuel compared to the older aircraft. They have 99 of these on order. They will be delivered till the end of 2027, and they will continue flying till at least 2050. They will require jet fuel because they're conventional technology. And the only option then remains sustainable aviation fuel. But I want to come back to your point because I believe you have officially called SAF smokescreen. But for an airline like Air France-KLM, they are, in the heart of, it's climate activism capital in Europe, in Paris and Amsterdam. They are renewing their fleet and they need SAF. Why is that smokescreen?
So, I mean, I think, first of all, to come back to your earlier point that you've cut back your flights from 75 a year, which is just mind-blowingly huge, to 7 return flights. I mean, for anyone to take 7 return flights a year is too much. But I do want to acknowledge that you've cut back your flights by a very, very significant amount. And if more people looked at the amount that they were flying and took the decision to cut back, that would be a really, really positive thing. That would be a big step forward. I mean, for the most frequent flyers to cut their flights in half, to cut their flights by a tenth, that in itself would I think be enough to get us the 1/3 reduction that is needed. And then your point about KLM and the aircraft that they've ordered. I mean, the airlines all like to say, oh, we're flying really efficient airplanes, oh, we're doing, fleet renewal. But, the reality is that the efficiency gains are fairly marginal. And as you say, this is, buying an aircraft is a long-term investment. These things will be flying for 30 years. And as you say, once an airline has bought an aircraft, then they want to put fuel in it because they want to fly it. I don't think that there will be alternative fuels available for those planes. Certainly not in 2050. There certainly won't be genuinely sustainable fuels for those aircraft. And so what we're looking at then is, it's essentially stranded assets. Those aircraft that have been bought by KLM will simply not be able to keep flying in 2050 in the very carbon constrained world that we would be living in then, unless we're in a situation of just sort of unconstrained climate collapse, which is not impossible, then those aircraft are going to be in the same situation as the oil and gas reserves that are owned by BP and Shell, that those fuels simply cannot be burned if we want anything like a livable future. And one of the reasons I find dealing with the aviation industry so difficult is because they are not accepting that basic fact. They're not looking at the lifetime of the infrastructure that they are currently investing in and saying, hang on, are we going to still be able to operate this in 30 years' time? They're trying to push forward with investments in these high carbon assets that are just, they're just not going to be able to use. And I do think that it's really irresponsible, particularly that, the judge had just ruled in the KLM case that the claims they're making about things like alternative fuels are greenwashing. And, that means that they're misleading customers, but it has a more important meaning than that, which is that the trajectory that the industry and the company are on to try to tackle their emissions simply is not going to work. That means their emissions are going to continue to be too high. And the more that they buy new aircraft and try to scale up and lock this in, the worse the situation is going to be. And it's just, it's very worrying that airlines are not willing to address this situation with any honesty or realism.
If I put myself in the shoes of an airline CEO or a CCO, I mean, this is a catch-22. You're saying you should not be buying new aircraft for growth or replacement. But at the same time, you can't continue flying the old aircraft because they are guzzlers.
So I think the issue is that the industry isn't, if it has to replace a certain number of aircraft, that it's not trying to scale down the numbers, it's trying to scale up the numbers. That is the problem. So
the other reality is that a lot of the European and North American airlines are not necessarily growing by 30-40% in their fleet sizes. The growth really is coming from India, Turkey, Indonesia, Philippines, for example. And for example, airlines in India have ordered more planes than the rest of the airlines in the world combined since 2023. So that's where growth is coming. And India does not have mandates. India does not have incentives like the IRA in the US. So how do we deal with that? And more importantly, I don't think Western nations are in a position to tell Indians who have never flown to not fly. Why shouldn't? Air India be expanding or Indigo be expanding for that matter?
Yeah, and I think this is the same situation that we're seeing across the global economy when it comes to wealthy developed countries with high current and historical levels of emissions and developing countries with much less responsibility for emissions. And I completely agree that there has to be fairness and equity between countries. I would completely agree that it's completely unfair for people in Western countries, in wealthier countries, in developed countries to keep on flying while telling developing countries that they need to cut back. But the reality is that across the world, collectively, we need to fly less. And there's a shrinking global carbon budget for aviation. That's just the physical reality of the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere. And within that limited remaining carbon budget, the greater equity we can have in terms of dividing that carbon budget between people and between countries, the fairer that is, the better it will be, and the more public acceptance that will have. And again, what that means is that frequent flyers have to fly less. And if what you want is for somebody in India who has never flown to be able to take a flight, then the reality is that people like you who are very frequent flyers have to cut back. So maybe you have to cut back from your current 7 flights per year. Maybe you have to cut back to 1 flight per year or 1 flight every 3 years or every 5 years. Like, are you willing to do that so that somebody who has never flown can get on a plane for the first time in their lifetimes? Because that is the situation that we're facing.
Absolutely. I think I'm a prime example of climate migration where it's discretionary, not indiscretionary. I was living up till recently in Whistler, BC, in Canada, on the West Coast, and living on the Pacific Northwest. Over the last 2 years, we launched our sustainability practice at Simply Flying, still while working with airlines, helping them become more sustainable. And I realized that almost every flight I took out of Vancouver was a long-haul flight. Miami, long haul. Mexico City, long haul. Tokyo, long haul. London, long haul. Everything was a long haul, 7 hours or more. And sure, Seattle was nearby, or San Francisco, but it was hard. And it was one of the deciding factors in my move to London, where my work flying has dramatically reduced because it's so much easier to get in and out of London, firstly on trains.
Yeah.
And secondly, on flights that are not necessarily long haul for everything when I do need to fly. I remember switching to train when I was offered by a client to be flown to Edinburgh for an aviation conference, for an aviation summit. And I said, no, I live near King's Cross, I will take the train. And I took the train, I took the Lumo, the electric train up, and I shared it. And I received lots of inquiries and positive comments, I would say, from friends in the aviation industry as well, because the alternates exist.
Yeah.
On the west coast of North America, that just was not an option. I could not have taken a train up to Edinburgh like I could here and be back the next day and pretty much on zero emissions. So yes, I personally am making those choices. And I think a lot of people I have met, I have encouraged them to just consciously think about their flying, whether they do need to fly so much and whether something can be done about it. The other thing we recommend in our book, Sustainability in the Air, is the concept of workations. Combine work and a vacation. So when you do need to fly, can you take family along, extend the trip by 3-7 days, and take a vacation instead of doing a separate vacation afterwards? So now you have 2 flights, two separate flights to do, and it's something that has worked as well. I'm curious though, just thinking outside that sector, Possible, of course, does a lot of advocacy work beyond aviation as well. And you've been running campaigns in the sports sector around sponsorships and football teams. Are you able to share some lessons from there that may be applicable to aviation as well?
Yeah, so we've done a couple of things relating to sport. One was the flight-free football campaign, and this was about Premier League football teams which were taking private jet flights to games within the UK. And we did some research which found that the vast majority of those trips could have been done by electric coach. within I think it was four hours or so. So the time savings that they got from taking private jets were minimal, and the increase in emissions was gigantic. We've also done some work on football and sports advertising. Obviously, there's a lot of aviation airline sponsorship in sport. And I think that's another area that is starting to get more public attention. There was recently the UN Secretary General made a really, really strong statement about fossil fuel advertising, and that this is just something that absolutely needs to stop. And it is encouraging that some public authorities are starting to take this seriously. So Edinburgh Council recently put a ban in place on advertising from fossil fuel companies, airports, airlines, weapons companies, on the grounds that it's just not compatible with the public interest mandate of a local council. So that was really, really good to see, and hopefully there will be more of that. And when we're thinking about ways to reduce demand for flights, then getting rid of advertising for flights is a sort of, it's a win-win. Nobody is going to feel, like they're missing out because they're bombarded with fewer advertisements telling them that they need to take another holiday and they need to get away, they need to book another cheap flight. And I think that could help to constrain demand for flights in a way that is going to cause, zero harm to the public, although of course it will eat into the aviation industry's profits.
Looks like airline marketing is about to become a very dangerous job.
I mean, well, we're also seeing there's more pressure, more attention being placed on people who work in advertising and marketing. I think there was some recent protests around the advertising company that Shell uses. We actually saw a publication produced by a company working on aviation advertising that was basically trying to advise people on how not to be accused of greenwash. And I think more and more sectors are going to be coming under pressure to look at what they're doing. Is it contributing to the climate crisis? If so, they need to stop it, because more and more people can see the scale and urgency of the crisis that we're facing.
Do you think aviation will lose its social license to operate if it continues the way it is?
Yeah, I absolutely do think that is what it is facing on its current trajectory. I think people can see that the claims it's making about its ability to tackle its emissions just don't stack up. People are very concerned about the expansion plans. There's quite a lot of local resistance to airport expansion. I think that there's multiple ways that the aviation industry could go. It could keep trying to go forwards with its current pathway, so things like expansion, alternative fuels. It could keep its current lobbying for the taxpayer to cover the cost of alternative fuels, or it could be honest and realistic about the crisis that we're facing and the lack of a technological solution to aviation emissions, and accept that in a high carbon world, we have to do less of things which produce huge amounts of emissions, and that includes flying. And I do acknowledge that airlines are in a really difficult position because their ongoing operation as businesses depends on profitability, and profitability depends on growth. Yes, that is a really, really difficult situation. They're going to have to come up with some way around it. Something like selling fewer tickets, but they cost more, something like that. But at the end of the day, if we have to choose between a livable climate and airline industry profits, I think it's clear which one we have to choose.
What do you think of the ongoing, I think, one flight free or flight free 1 year campaign that has been growing in popularity in the UK?
Yeah, so I think it's really, really good. I think it's really, it provides a very nice platform for people to make a commitment to going flight free, whether that's for a year or longer, and sort of be supported and have a community of people who are doing that. And I think, I've definitely noticed that even for people who fly frequently, being around people like me who don't fly can help them to stop and think about their travel. I've noticed friends start to think about moving at least some of their journeys to train travel. So, yeah, I think it's really positive. It's helping to denormalize frequent flying, a cultural shift towards choosing ways of traveling that don't harm the climate.
That is a reasonable ask that, can everyone just think of ways to travel that can lower the carbon footprint and you can still get there, for example. I'm curious, when was the last time you flew?
I think it was about 7 years ago. And I went on holiday with some friends, and on the flight back, I realised that although I'd had a lovely time, I just could not justify to myself that level of emissions. It just, it felt to me like it was wrong for someone who's a climate activist and cares about the climate. But I think it's important to remember that no one is saying no one can ever get on a plane again. We're saying we need to cut back on flying, and the people who have to cut back are the people who fly most often.
Will you ever get back on a plane?
I don't know. I think it's unlikely. I certainly don't have any plans to get on a plane. I'm lucky that I have family living in Europe who I can get to very easily on the Eurostar. And of course, I do recognise that for people who have family and loved ones living in places that are not accessible by plane, that it is more difficult. But part of the reason I think it's so important that we cut back on all the, unnecessary flights, all the, leisure travel that could just as easily and happily be done by train travel is to try and preserve some remaining carbon budget for the journeys that are really important to people and can't be done by other ways than flying.
And I think similarly, if we split out the frequent flying amongst people from the developed countries, they should think about, or we should think about our frequent flying, so that the carbon budget remains for the developing countries and people who might be flying for the first time or experiencing the magic of flight for the first time.
Yeah. I mean, how about you? Would you be able to do even a year without flying, a year with just travelling by train? I mean, the UK has fantastic train links to Europe. The Eurostar is incredibly easy. I mean, why not give it a go? Why not see how long you can go without flying? You might find you enjoy not having to deal with airports, not having to, sit on a tiny cramped metal tube. Enjoy train travel.
I have enjoyed the train travel I have done till now. I actually got the rail pass for my family. So we've been taking lots of little train holidays since we moved to the UK to towns like Nottingham, and we discovered the caves. My daughters were so fascinated that people could actually live underground, not forced to, but just live as a lifestyle. So yes, we have started exploring that lifestyle. But the reality of at least my work is that I have to fly to faraway places for work, because I truly believe that if I can have the biggest impact in helping airlines transition towards sustainability in the next 5 years, that will have an outsized impact on their lower carbon emissions in 35 years after that.
I mean, I think the problem is that the only way for aviation to become more sustainable within the next 5 years is to cut back on flying. There's no other pathway for them to do that. And I think it's really important that people in the aviation industry should start to be more honest about that, and to start talking and thinking about demand reduction and acknowledging the reality of that. And I think the more that people, well-meaning people who care about the climate talk about things like alternative fuels, like they're a solution, and then this is okay, and we can just keep on flying without worrying about it and thinking our emissions will be dealt with, I do think that is a problem.
I hear you. I do hear you. But I think the reality, realistically speaking, I don't see global aviation demand reducing anytime soon. Yes, there may be pockets like Sweden or Scandinavia where indeed there's degrowth in flying because of flight shaming and other factors. And yes, I agree with you that there's potentially a case for a frequent flyer levy. There is potentially a case for frequent flyers to rethink their travels and their travel patterns. But at the same time, the growth coming from the developing world is more than going to take care of any degrowth that happens in the developed world?
I mean, I think we have to look at the kind of world that we're going to end up living in. I mean, 20 years ago, somebody could have said, oh, I don't see us burning less oil and gas. The reality is that we have to stop burning oil and gas if we want a planet that's compatible with human life and human civilization. And we're already seeing more resistance to high carbon industries, to air travel, because people can see the impact on the climate. I mean, the summer before last, it hit 40 degrees in the UK, runways melted. And to say, oh, well, I think that, high carbon industries will just continue as usual, I don't think that's, I don't think that's a viable option. But I also want to acknowledge that for many countries around the world, it is much harder to travel without flying than it is in the UK. I mean, we're really lucky. We do have train services. They're not as good as they could and should be. We've got the Eurostar. But yet in many other countries, it is harder to travel without flying. But to me, what that means is that, the entire global travel infrastructure has to change in the same way that the global energy system has to change. The way that we all heat our homes have to change. Globally, for a lot of people, diets will have to change as well. And, there's going to be a need for much more train travel, much more electric coaches, electric cars to some extent as well. So, yeah, the whole global travel infrastructure is going to have to change if we want to get emissions on track while, people still having the mobility that they need. But I think just to say, oh, well, flying will keep on happening it's almost quite defeatist, because, there is an alternative. And in terms of what is feasible within current technologies and what minimizes use of energy and costs, getting more electric railway lines in place is going to be much more feasible than thinking that we can run the world's entire global fleet of planes on e-fuels. That is just not going to happen. But we could run a lot more trains with a lot more renewable electricity than we have at the moment.
That's very interesting. That's a comparison I've never, thought through in terms of electric trains versus PTL for airlines. Now, there are, of course, if you look at any of the airlines' decarbonisation charts till 2050, there are multiple pathways. There is operational efficiency that can be achieved today. There is sustainable aviation fuel. There is hydrogen. There is electric aircraft. Which of these pathways do you think has the biggest potential to help decarbonize if we take demand management aside?
So, I mean, the reason that we keep talking about demand management is that the combination of all those pathways is going to be insufficient to get reductions in emissions of the scale needed. I mean, efficiency is, it's sort of diminishing returns at this point without completely redesigning aircraft in a way that is going to be extremely difficult, extremely expensive. Hydrogen electric are going to be very hard. Batteries are extremely heavy. Hydrogen has very high storage density. No one has got close to getting over those technological barriers for anything more than tiny, basically test planes. And, an electric transatlantic plane is, it's decades off if it's ever going to actually emerge. And of course, even if it did, it's still going to be much, much more energy efficient to use surface transport than to lift things into the air and keep them there. That's just the amount of energy that it needs. So I think, I struggle to see any way of flying within the next few decades that is not going to produce a huge amount of emissions. Like, realistically, it's just not looking likely. Which is why we keep coming back to demand constraint. And I think as well, if the aviation industry surprises everyone and in 20 years' time it delivers an electric plane that, can fly 200 people across the Atlantic, then that will be great. Everybody will be very surprised. It'll be very welcome. But there's no sign of that happening. And even when it does, the industry will also have to replace the entire global fleet of aircraft. That's going to be slow, it's going to be expensive, it's going to have to completely rework airports to provide alternative ways of refueling planes. Again, that will be slow, it will be difficult, it will be expensive. And I think the point for me is that until the industry has actually managed to decarbonise its operations, then it needs to be looking at cutting back. We can't have the current situation where the industry wants to keep burning more and more kerosene on the promise that one day it's going to have magical emissions-free aircraft. That's the wrong way around.
What would you change about the current UK Jet Zero strategy?
So, we're not a fan of the Jet Zero strategy. We're actually taking the current government to court over it. We filed for 2 judicial reviews because we think it is so dangerous for the climate. There are some good bits in it. The kind of overall ambition for the sector to get its emissions on track. There's some accountability mechanisms within it. The main problems are that the accountability mechanisms are too slow, that they don't contain any enforcement mechanisms, and also that the strategy bakes in huge increases in demand, a 50% increase in passengers. And, even with very optimistic assumptions about efficiency improvements and alternative fuel rollout and all the rest of it, that is going to see absolute emissions increasing. And another problem with the Jet Zero strategy is it sort of acknowledges that the industry's emissions are still going to be incredibly high by 2050, and it's expecting tens of millions of tons of carbon removals to be happening by 2050, which again is just completely unrealistic. Who's going to pay for it? Where are the resources going to come from? How is this going to happen? It's just completely unrealistic.
Okay, so there's the enforcement bit. I can't shake off this feeling that you're very active in filing lawsuits, from BA and Virgin to the UK government.
No, we've only filed 2 laws. We've only filed two JRs. The actions against airlines were just formal complaints. That's outside the UK courts mechanism. So just the 2 lawsuits.
Okay, I had Hiske Arts on this podcast from Fossil Fuel Netherlands as well, and I cannot shake off the feeling that climate activists and groups like that use lawsuits as a marketing strategy. Would you agree with that?
I'd say we use it when we've exhausted all other options. We have been trying for so long to do, reasonable policy-based engagement with UK government, with the aviation industry, even with airports, about the need for realism, about technological solutions and sensible measures to cut back on demand, and they've refused to listen. We've seen an escalation in misleading claims, in unreasonable, unrealistic growth pathways, and for us, it really, it's a sort of strategy of last resort. But I do think that if the industry continues on its current pathway, more and more groups and organisations are going to be seeking to use legal measures to constrain them. That's a risk that they face, along with other high carbon sectors. And you might have seen there was a really good ruling the other week that a UK drilling project couldn't go ahead because it's the emissions from actually burning the fuel that was extracted hadn't been taken into account, and actually those emissions did need to be factored in. And I don't know if that is also going to start applying to airports as well, in the sense, because a lot of them, like Heathrow, they're refusing to factor in the emissions that come from the aircraft that they fly.
The scope 3 emissions.
Yeah. I mean, to most reasonable people, that's clearly ridiculous. You can't just, ignore the vast majority of your emissions and say that they somehow don't count. So I think that's a positive development. And yeah, the aviation industry should expect more and more public opposition and concern and resistance, because we all have to live on this planet.
Definitely. Fair enough. On that somber note, why don't we turn to the final part of this, into where we get to know you personally a little bit. And usually this is the easiest question for my guests, but I'm going to start with, what's your favorite airline?
Yeah, so I'm sure it won't surprise you to know that I think they're pretty much all as bad as each other.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, can I just, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say Eurostar.
I love it.
But, for people living in the UK, Yes, it would be nice if Eurostar was cheaper. I completely agree with that. But it's very easy to travel to a lot of destinations within Europe without flying. I'm actually looking at going to Spain in the autumn to visit some family, southern Spain. And you can actually do a really, really nice train journey to southern Spain with one night in Barcelona. It actually is doable. It's slower, it's more expensive than I'd like, but it is possible. And of course, for a lot of people going on holiday from the UK, it is to European destinations. And if we had more affordable, accessible trains, then it would be easier for more people to travel without flying.
Eurostar as your favorite airline. I think that's a first on this podcast. What's your favorite book, Ellie?
I'm not sure if I have a favourite book. I like Naomi Klein a lot. You might have read things by her. She wrote The Shock Doctrine. This Changes Everything, which is her book about climate change. It's really good. I'd recommend it. It's about the inequality angles of tackling the climate crisis.
I'll check it out. Thank you. Your favorite city?
That's a tricky one. I like London a lot, especially in summer. The parks are really nice. I've been spending quite a lot of time in the Netherlands recently because I have family there. And again, very easy to get to by train. Really nice place.
Okay. Your favorite movie?
I don't know if I really have a favourite film. I really enjoyed the new Dune film, which came out quite recently, Dune 2. Lots of stuff in there about resource extraction and colonialism, which I think is sadly very relevant to the world today.
Okay, what is something you'd like to learn?
Probably rock climbing, I think.
Okay, good luck with that. What do you do in your free time right now?
I do a lot of climate activism, unsurprisingly, seeing friends, running, going to the pub.
Okay, the best advice you've received?
Celebrate small wins.
Okay. Then if we are meeting 1 year from today and we are popping champagne, what's that small win we are celebrating?
I would love to see the new government that is coming in within the next few weeks change the worst bits of the Jet Zero strategy and have more of an accountability framework for aviation, that they need to get their emissions down, which really is the most important thing for the sector.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ellie.
I don't know if you want to finish on a more positive note, because I feel like you feel I've been very, very negative. I guess I would just say that, it's not doom and gloom. We're not saying no one can ever fly. We're certainly not saying no one can ever go on holiday. We're saying let's all collectively do more train travel. Let's cut back on unnecessary flights. Let's try and get the small group of people who are the ones causing this problem, the frequent flyers, the private jet users. Let's get those people to change their behaviour. Let's get this industry on a pathway that is actually more sustainable. Let's, stop believing in magical solutions, and let's do the things that actually work.
Well, let's end on that more positive note now. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Sustainability in the Air. Aviation is one of the hardest to decarbonize industries, yet there are multiple paths to get to net zero. Awareness is key to a green future. So please give us your support to help our sustainable aviation insights reach a wider audience. You can do this by sharing this episode on your network, on LinkedIn, Twitter, or even WhatsApp. Or perhaps you might consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to this episode. You can start a conversation with us by writing to us at podcast@simplifying, that's simply with an i.com. And for more content on sustainable aviation, please visit our website green.simplifying.com and join the movement. Sustainability in the Air is an original podcast by Simplifying. The show is produced by Juraj Toth in Slovakia. Dirk Singer is our Director of Sustainability, who leads research for each interviewee out of Greenwich, UK. Shubhadeep Pal is our supervising editor based out of Mumbai and Singapore. The articles are written by Ayushi Badola in Dehradun in India, and Meera Hull in Montreal, Quebec. Creative design is led by Ligia Esteve in Montreal. Baiba Drimain is the project director for the show based out of Valencia, Spain. Special thanks to Wendy Sim in Singapore. And I'm Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simplifying and your host. Please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn.